name is Jason from OISP, and today we're going to be considering the complete IELTS book, Unit 3, and this is the speaking portion that deals with, in particular, Part 2. So here's our learning outcomes for today. We're going to try to learn more about Part 2 and just what it entails and what we have to do. We're going to try to learn how to use synonyms and paraphrasing. That means changing some of the words, especially from the question. And we're going to try to learn some vocabulary that we can use in our speaking responses. And finally, we'll hear a sample speaking response from Part 2. So as you can see, Part 2 fits in nicely with Part 1 and Part 3, but it's a little bit different. In this one, you have about 1 minute to prepare some notes, and that's the only part that we can do that with. And then we speak for 1 to 2 minutes on that topic, and the examiner will stop when you continue speaking too long. So you just can keep speaking until he says thank you, and then you can stop. So the topic is usually a personal topic or perhaps an experience that you've had in the past. So in that way it's similar to Part 1. Here are some common questions that you might see, some examples from Part 2, to describe something you own that has improved your life. To describe a place you have visited where you can see interesting animals. To describe a book or article that you enjoyed reading. Or to describe your idea of a perfect holiday. So those are personal questions that you can answer, your personal interests or your personal experiences. So here are some tips, some ways that you can get a high score in speaking Part 2. You have 1 minute to prepare and take some notes. So make sure to use that minute to write down some ideas of things that you want to say, and make sure you use the task card well. For your introduction, don't repeat the question word for word. So that means we might need to change some of the words in the question. That shows your vocabulary use. And finally, while you're speaking, you can look down at your notes, but try to maintain eye contact with the teacher. That is, look at the teacher also, and continue speaking until the examiner says thank you. So now we'll look at some ways that we can improve our score, and especially by changing the words of the question, using some different words, some synonyms that mean the same thing. So here's our example question to describe a journey that you made in the past that you remember well. And then there's some extra questions underneath to help us. So we look at first that word journey. Now we can use that word as okay, but it's good to think of some synonyms, some words that mean the same thing. So as we're speaking, we can use some extra words, some extra vocabulary. So journey, the first word that I thought of was a trip, perhaps a vacation or a holiday. So now you have 4 different words that you can use for this same idea. Then we have the word remember well. And this one's a little bit more difficult, and maybe you don't know any other words for remember. So if that's the case, then you can use the word remember as okay. But what came to my mind was the word recall. So now we have a synonym that we can use for remember. And then we notice the word forms of transportation. So what are some other words for forms? Well, maybe you could change that to kinds of transportation or types of transportation. And finally, traveled with. And this is a verb that we can change, maybe something simpler like to go with or went with if it's in the past tense. Maybe journeyed with, or I was accompanied by. So these are all ways that we can change the words of the question just a little bit as we're speaking to show more vocabulary use. So now we'll listen to an actual response from a Part 2 speaking question. And you can see how we use some of these tips, these ideas to make the response better. So here's our question. It's the same one we just looked at to describe a journey in the past that you remember well. So I'm going to address this question. So I enjoy traveling. So I've been on many trips over the course of my life, but one trip that stands out above others is when I went to Toronto when I was about 23 or 24 years old. We went by car because of the distance. We couldn't go by plane because it was too expensive. I was accompanied by 3 of my friends. My roommate went with me. Also, a friend from Cambodia came with me, and he figured he could find a girlfriend while he was in Toronto. Also, a 3rd friend went with us. There were many highlights to the trip that I really remember. It was really nice to go on a road trip with my friends. It was the first time I'd really done that kind of thing, and we had a blast. Also, the food that we had, the cuisine was just exceptional, and I really enjoyed the food that we had. But there were some negative things also. The first was money. We all had different amounts of money, and when we had to decide where to eat, what kind of cuisine to have, well, sometimes we couldn't agree on what we should eat. But overall, it was a really good trip. I made a lot of friends on that trip, and I still keep in touch with them even today, living very far away from them as I do now. And so when I think back and I recall all the fond memories that I have from that trip, it really makes me happy. So now we'll look at some of the things that we did in that speaking part 2 response. First of all, as you recall in your notes, don't write down too many things in your notes. You want to write some things, but you don't want to write a full sentence. So when you take notes, that's a good thing to keep in mind. And when you're speaking, you have the task card. The teacher will give that to you before you start speaking. So while you speak, you can use that card to help you if maybe you can't think of what to say. Or you can look down at the card and there's some suggestions, and you saw that on the screen while I was speaking. Also, you'll notice that we changed the words in the question a little bit. We used some synonyms, some words that mean the same thing. And lastly, you saw some vocabulary that we used, including some idioms, some phrases that we use in English. So to review, remember to take that 1 minute time to prepare and take your notes. Write down some ideas that you have, or some students like to write down vocabulary that they want to use. If you can, try to change the words of the question just a little bit to show some better vocabulary use. And then when you're speaking, try to use a wide variety of vocabulary. So now we'll review some of the vocabulary that we used in part 2. Now that might be new for you. The first one you noticed was stand out. That's a verb. It means that something is easy to see or easy to notice. Stand out. Maybe you can try the pronunciation on your own. So it's good when something is special. We can use that word to describe something as a special trip in this case. I use the word accompanied by, which just means that someone went with me. I use the word figured, which is a good word that you can use when you want to say something that you think or you suppose. Maybe your opinion. We say, I figured. I use the word a highlight, which means a good thing, or maybe the thing that you remember the most, in this case from a trip. Highlight. We also had a little bit of a slang word or an idiom in there, to have a blast. So that's a very common phrase we say in English. To have a blast means to enjoy yourself, to have a really good time. Also use the word cuisine, which is a nice word that you can use instead of food. Sometimes if we're describing food, we use the same words over and over again. So cuisine is another word for food. And then lastly, I used the words keep in touch and recall. So keep in touch means to continue to talk to, or maybe email or send letters to. to be in contact with someone. So in this case, I was describing someone who lives far away, but we still keep in touch in various ways. And finally, the word recall, which as we mentioned before, means to remember. So again, that's recall.